Hi, so in this very quickly arranged World of Warcraft, what I want to talk about is Blizzard's latest absolutely madcap scheme. This as an idea is off the chart. Now, what it is it's to do with talents and respecs. They have now, at the early part of Legion, they were going to allow, or they have allowed, you to change between any of your specs, so dual spec isn't really a thing anymore. And I did a World of Warcraft quite a while ago, arguing that this is an anachronism anymore. The idea of dual spec is no longer valid. It was a good idea at the time, and it was useful at the time. But the way the talents work now, it makes no sense at all. And I can understand how people who've only been playing the game for a couple of expansions might have just accept it because it's just the way they've always known it. But it really doesn't make any sense if you think about it. So they've allowed us to change between the three. There was a cost initially in Alpha, and they said they were going to have a cost. They just weren't sure what that cost should be. Now they've abandoned that altogether and just said, well, look, as long as you're out of combat and it's going to take a certain amount of time to cast it, then you can change spec. I suppose the restriction on spec is can you keep up with multiple artifact weapons, which may take some considerable amount of time for, for everyone, never mind most people. But this one relates to talent, so now what they're not happy about is the fact that we can freely change talents. Despite the fact that when the new talent system came in Mists of Pandaria, this was the whole point. The issue with the older talents, the old style talent trees that they had, was they thought, well, there's too many talents that don't really do a lot. We want to have a smaller number of meaningful talents. Now, I was a little concerned. I wasn't as keen because immediately my concern was, well, this means I have to keep changing talents from fight to fight. And I wasn't the only one with this concern. And Blizzard's response was, yes, this is a good thing. You know, the flexibility to be able to change. Well, now they're saying that's a really bad thing. So a bit of a U-turn there. So now they want to punish us. They want to stop us using talents. Now, I need to read this through a little bit. I have to read through what they say, and I'm going to respond as and when, if you haven't already seen this. So if you have read this, apologies, but I am going to add my commentary into it. So we've definitely heard much feedback to this effect. They've heard lots of feedback. I mean, straight away, they are changing so much in Legion, a lot of which I would say is unnecessary. They're doing so many good things in Legion in terms of the content, because that was ultimately what they were slated for with WoD, content. Not anything else, really. Content. They're putting in now lots of content. And now they're like making new enemies, it seems to me, by changing a load of things completely unnecessarily. And in a lot of cases, not all, but in a lot of cases, completely against the wishes of the community. But I'm not going to get into that. That's a totally separate issue. So we've definitely heard much feedback to this effect. And this is something we've been discussing quite a bit internally as well as over the past couple of weeks. In an upcoming build, hopefully the next one, if not the one after, the respec cost is gone and players can freely switch between all specializations with the normal restrictions of cast time needing to be out of combat and so forth. Fine, good, yes. Ultimately, the intent behind the respec cost, which isn't really a new concept, dating back to 2004 class trainers, yes, sure, of course it was to help reinforce a bit of spec identity through declaring a primary spec to which you could always return for free and to serve as a mild goal sink, but in practice changing specialisation is a pretty significant transformation in terms of action bars, optimal gear in some cases, artefacts and so forth, and already not something that people were taking lightly. I suspect the cost will not be missed. Okay. An area that has appeared to need a bit more friction, however, is actual talent changes, especially with no reagent cost at all now. This is true. And the other, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's really good now. You can just click on the talent and it's there, as long as you're out of combat. It can be all too easy to activate AoE talents before larger packs of enemies in a dungeon and then switch back to single target talents before a lieutenant or a boss. Or someone might, that's the first term I've heard the term lieutenant used for a mob in World of Warcraft. How interesting. Or someone might switch to a passive movement speed talent when traversing an area and then back to something functional before entering combat. Well, yes, that's what people would do. And I know I had a beef with it. Anyone who's like a Retribution Paladin following my channel, you will know I have a massive issue because me using my greater blessings, whenever the target changes talents, those greater blessings fade, and I have to put them back on again, and I can't put them on in combat, so that's a huge hassle. So in theory, what they're doing would sort of help me from that point of view, but it's helping me deal with what is a bad mechanic to start with. At that point, we're often hardly talking about a meaningful choice at all, but rather a nuisance of extra button presses or UI navigation before you can use your desired talents. So they're trying to spin it as if they're doing something that will benefit us, that's a quality of life thing for us. Is anyone seriously going to consider it a quality of life feature that people can't change talents between single target and AoE spec? I don't think people are going to be going, oh, thanks, Blizzard, I really hate pressing those few buttons. Now, I find it a nuisance. I'm not saying they're wrong. It's a nuisance. I have always found it a nuisance. And although I now accept it, I have never really liked that aspect of the new talent system. However, and so alongside removing the respec cost, that same upcoming build will also restrict the ability to change talents when away from a safe area, defined as an area that provides the rested state. We currently, now, right, before I do the next sentence, and you can read it anyway. So what they're saying is, you're not changing talents unless you're like in a city or an inn somewhere else. That's it. You're in a raid, you're not changing talents. And the reason they're saying is because we don't want you to do this because apparently it's a nuisance for you. You poor boys, we've listened to you. Boys and girls, sorry. And we don't want you doing that. But here's the next thing. We currently plan to give scribes a recipe to craft a consumable tome that can be dropped in order to allow all nearby players to retalent freely for a time, particularly useful for group play. So on the one hand, they're saying they don't want people switching to AoE just before trash packs and then back to single target for a boss. They don't want people when they're traversing, like, you know, these distances, getting right, say corpse running back in a raid. They don't want them to switch to a movement speed talent and then change to another one. And yet they say they're going to create a consumable to allow us to do just that. Well, sorry, either it's a bad idea that we can change talents in a dungeon or raid, or it's not. Because this isn't about solo play. In solo play, you can find an inn and change talents. It's not that, okay, it's mildly annoying to have to go to the inn. Where this is a real downside is in dungeons and raids, and it's deliberately been made so. So I don't buy it because they're contradicting themselves. If they're saying it's bad that we retalent, then why are they giving us a consumable to retalent? And do you know what I think it is? I don't think they have a problem with us changing talents. I think they have a problem with inscription. The inscription profession came in for Wrath, and it came in to bring in glyphs. Glyphs wasn't about in TBC, except for the pre-Wrath expansion patch. It wasn't about in TBC, it wasn't about vanilla. It was this thing that came in to allow us to customize our baseline abilities so that we could make them more powerful in one way, maybe there'd be a drawback in another way, that sort of thing. The glyph system has changed and changed, and now they're basically, it looks like they basically wish they'd never done it, or they wish it wasn't in the game, because the inscription profession makes now no sense in Legion. So what it's like doing, instead of just saying, look, we're just going to get rid of inscription because we don't want it anymore, let's just, you know, the people who are scribes will allow them to switch to any profession they like at like 700 or whatever their level is in inscription. Allow them the equivalent one in a profession. They can change it to whatever they like one time only. We'll give them all the patterns that they would be able to get from vendors and vendor bought recipes so that they're not penalised, and just call it quits. No, instead of, and I'm not saying people would be happy about that, but instead of doing that, they've come up with lots and lots of stupid things for scribes to make. So they've got like the weekly glyph thing that we talked about at BlizzCon. I haven't seen a huge amount of it, but you know, and there's the runes you can give to give yourself like extra versatility and stuff like that. And now this, they've thought to themselves, well, scribes are still not all that useful. We need something else for inscription to be able to make. I know, instead of being able to change talents with like this tome that you can buy off of any old vendor, that you can buy off your yak, Why don't we make scribes produce these resources? So that's what they're doing, really. They're saying we don't need a resource to change talents. We actually do. They're just making this reagent a craftable item that will cost. They haven't said what yet, but they're implying that it's going to be a significant outlay in terms of materials, because they've said it's not going to be the sort of thing you're going to stack up and just use it at will while you're on your own. It's more of a group thing. So it's going to be a considerable cost, you would think. Like not like 100 gold or anything like that. Maybe like the drums for when you're in a dungeon group that doesn't have heroism, that sort of thing. Maybe that sort of cost. So like it's significant. You're probably not going to use it for solo stuff, but you know, maybe it's not going to be horrendously expensive. But still, it just sounds to me that they haven't got a problem with changing talents because they're allowing us to do it. They just want something else for scribes to do. And that's just what it reads to me. So, you know, I'll carry on. A couple of clarifications, one of which will probably be a relief and the other likely less so. The inscription consumable as currently planned would be something that anyone could drop. So in other words, you know, it's not just scribes that can use this thing, anyone can. Not a profession requiring an item like a Jeeves, but in terms of the materials required, we're thinking of something that's more aimed at groups, probably not the sort of thing an individual is likely to carry a stack of and use freely, as I just mentioned. This is clearly more restrictive than the way it works in Warlords. No shit, Sherlock. Why would we ever add restrictions to something like this? You took the words right out of my mouth, but I think I know why, and I've just said why. But what are you going to say is the reason? Do we just sit around and amuse ourselves by thinking of things to take away from players? They've added in brackets, we don't. I am beginning to think, and I've said this in Guild, I think there's a crazy competition on. I think they have a competition on for who can come up with the maddest ideas for Legion. And the winner gets like a basket of blueberry muffins, is what I said. I think that's what's happening. Most of the ideas go into the Rets, of course, the Ret Paladin. Salty tears. But yeah, so I don't think they do it to amuse themselves. I think it's a competition. I think they just, I think this is a thing. But anyway, ultimately, for a choice to be meaningful, there has to be some associated cost or trade-off in the process. The associated cost or trade-off is that if you choose this talent, you can't take any of the other two in the same row. Are they actually treating us like idiots here? Sorry, I don't want to do the old negative Blizzard bashing thing. And I think people who follow my channel know that I don't do that a lot. But sometimes, what the hell? The trade-off is that you're picking this talent means you can't pick one of the other two because there's 3 in each row. That's how it works. That's the trade-off. That's the cost. I don't even know. I'm going to carry on. I'm going to carry on. But it's just getting farcical now. Do you want to eat your cake or do you want to save it for another time? What cobblers? You've got this is a totally false analogy. Totally false. If you could do both, that wouldn't be much of a choice. Doing both in this case means having all the talents in a row. We don't have all the talents in a row. We have one. As I said before, that's the trade-off. When it comes to talents which serve the primary purpose of customization and differentiation, consider 2 extremes in terms of how they could be handled. Please take a moment to think through the following scenarios. Okay, they're explaining themselves. We'll do them the courtesy of following it through with an open mind. First, what if you could switch talents freely at any time, including while in combat? Okay, we'll carry on. You'd effectively no longer have a talent system. You'd have a spell book with another 21 active passive abilities in it, with keybinds to swap between them as needed. Every player of a given spec would have identical capabilities, with some cumbersome interface management required to swap among them on the fly. Okay, so we'll take that one. Yeah, no one's arguing for that. No one is suggesting we should be able to change talents in combat. No one. Maybe someone is. Someone's going to prove me wrong by saying, I want that. I've not seen any significant amount of people, or indeed anyone, saying this on forums. So no one has asked for this. Second, what if you could literally never switch talents, short of making a brand new character? Really? Are they trying to make out that this... Oh, no, let's carry on. Let's open mind, open mind. I'm going to need to open my mind after this, I tell you. Bleed myself. Choosing a talent would be a far, far weightier choice than any decision you currently make in the game, other than choosing your starting class, I suppose. Some favoured cookie-cutter specs would emerge, but with 2,187 different permutations of talents, there'd be significantly more variety among players, but some niche talents would likely go almost entirely unused, though players who did choose them would be invaluable when those situations arose. And feeling like you've made a mistake and were stuck with one or more talents that you didn't like at all might completely sour your enjoyment of a character. So what they're trying to bill is they've put these two ridiculous, if I might say so, not realistic. If they actually want to argue this sensibly, this is where I now know that what they're saying is untrue. Sorry, I'm calling bullshit on this. Because if you were actually genuinely believe that what you were saying is correct, you would present a sensible argument. And the sensible argument would not be two ridiculous extremes, it would be two realistic extremes. Neither of these extremes is realistic. No one is suggesting that we should be able to switch talents in combat. Neither is anyone suggesting that we should never be able to switch talents once we've chosen our talents. They're not realistic extremes. So presenting this new wacky idea as a halfway house is completely spurious. It's a totally invalid argument. It's absolute crazy. I do not know who they're trying to fool. I seriously do not know. Anyway, we are of course doing neither of these things. No, you're doing something equally ridiculous. But there's a full spectrum of choice that lies in between. We've generally moved away from the second scenario and closer to the first over time. Years and years back, respecs were so expensive in relative terms that players often waited for class changes to automatically refund their talents rather than spend gold, blah, blah, blah. It used to be expensive. I absolutely agree. During TBC, in the first part of TBC, while I was still holy, for raids, I used to actually respec ret at the weekends, not just for fun, but to actually farm much more efficiently. Now, I got enough money from the farming to not only do get what I needed to get, but also cover the costs of the respecs, because I had to respec once and then again. But yes, it was a very significant cost. I didn't do it just between raids. This was purely at the weekend when there wasn't going to be any raiding. You know, and they were very expensive. They were. Like, and in Sunwell Plateau, for example, when we were clearing Sunwell Plateau, I've mentioned this before, I used to go DPS for the first couple of bosses. Then I would go tank, so protection spec for Fell Mist. Then I would go, you know, and I keep having to get people to make me portals to Stormwind and then get summoned back. Then I would get Eridar Twins was next. It'd be Retribution spec for that. Then I would spec tank again for Muru and Tropius. Then spec ret again for Kil'jaeden. And that, you know, the guild obviously supplied me with the gold for that. They wouldn't expect me to be able to shell that out in the way that now, of course, we're expected to be able to, you know, no one gives us gold to go and respec now because it's not a significant cost in WoD. So they're absolutely right on that. No argument about that. It's just not relevant as far as I can see. There's still a fair bit of thought that goes into which talents to select for a raid encounter. Yes. Where you're in combat for several minutes in a row and facing a variety of threats, and you may have to weigh whether you want better AoE damage from minions in the first phase or better single target burst later in the fight. Yeah, some specs have that choice to make, not always. Whether you want a passive movement speed increase for higher overall uptime or an on-demand active movement ability, or some specs, of course, don't get either. Thanks very much. In case you get targeted by a specific troublesome ability and so forth. But most other content, whether it's a single quest boss out in the world or a dungeon that breaks down to a series of sub 1 minute combats, don't offer nearly that much variety, and so you take the AoE talent for AoE pack and the single talent for the lone boss to the point where you might as well end up having both of them all of the time, which might be powerful but won't be choice. Absolute codswallop, because you haven't got them both at the same time. You don't at all. I will say this though, I did note when I was doing my the alpha stuff and I was going through dungeons, I was deliberately picking towards the end sets of talents that I didn't have to change through the dungeon. People thought I was mad. Why would you do that? Well, it's come to fruition now. There's one last little thing, but this is totally crazy. This is to do with PvP, I think. I'm actually relieved to hear that a scribe is not a necessity. Well, you need them to make them. But what I would like to know is if PvP is being kept in mind. For example, I might throw my PvP gear to do a battleground. Let's say that takes me 15 minutes. After that, I'm called to a raid. I need to change out my talents twice because we all know a certain talent's better for PvP, blah, 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 of course. I'm not really going to use Spring Blossoms in PvP just for movement, but I might in PvE during an encounter thingy. In this case, if you're returning to any safe area in between activities, you could change talents freely with no cooldown, cost, or other restriction. And this is another thing that I'm going to pick on here, because what we've got here, I haven't actually read the forum where I haven't read everyone's responses. There's going to be a lot of responses to this. Everyone's got a view on this, and not a positive one. So my problem with this response, let's imagine for a moment that I represent a company that's done something that no one likes, and there's all sorts of arguments flying my way. What I would do is I'd go through all the arguments, I would pick on the weakest argument, and then I would debunk that argument. That way I get to say that I'm engaging and I'm addressing concerns, but I don't have to actually answer any of the actual arguments. That's what's happened there. Someone has said, someone has misread it, they've missed out the bit about the fact you can change them perfectly freely in a safe zone, and when you switch between PvP and go into a raid, you're going to pass through a safe zone. They've picked on that and answered that. So they can say they've given feedback without having to address any of the genuine concerns. Again, it's a standard tactic used when you don't want to tackle the actual argument, when you don't want to engage in the debate because you know you're not on a position of strength. And this comes back to the fact, I very genuinely think, this is deliberate ploy to have something for scribes to do, because they've really taken away the glyph system now. Just isn't really there. They're gonna leave some bare bones of it in, but the profession as it originally intended just doesn't exist. And I think they're just coming up with things to make scribes feel that they have something useful to do. And it's such a nightmare. I mean, what, for example, so, I mean, look at this, for example, in a raid. So you get a raid group, they've all changed, someone's used the book, everyone's changed their talent, and then someone disconnects, and they have to get someone else in. So you're on the bench, you come in. Everyone's just changed their talents. Someone now has to pop a book just for you to change your talents, perhaps, okay? Because you don't necessarily know what the situation is. You could argue, okay, wherever you were, if you were just, you might not be outside the raid instance, you might get summoned in, so maybe you were in a safe place, you could change them before then. But it's so much messing about. And what if you didn't? What if you came and you thought, oh no, that talent, I need to change that talent. Someone's going to have to pop one just for you, or you are. There's so many problems with this. And it's a bad system. And it's a bad system to plaster over another bad system. But anyway, that's it. That's the situation. What do you think? Oh my God. Does anyone actually want this system? I'm so interested. Put in the comments below if there's an actual argument you can come up with, because Blizzard are not coming up with any arguments for this. This is smokescreen. Everything they said on this is smokescreen. But if you've actually got an argument for it, please put it in. I mean it, please, because I want to see another point of view of this. I do not like only having one point of view to something, only one perspective, because I don't feel then that my opinion is as valid as it should be, because I want to see something from both sides. And I don't see this from two sides. I just see this as something for scribes to do. Can't think of anything good for scribes to do. Don't want to get rid of the profession because we look stupid and we cause a load of anger, as if this isn't going to. So we're going to do this. But anyway, if you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and absolutely comment on the official forums where this is as well. And until next time, I'll see you later.